Hello class, it's me, and yes, I am wearing this. And I'm going to take off this thing now. This is the Mempo, the face mask. Yeah, you see, the thing is, samurai were wealthy, your instructor is not. And because they were wealthy, and I'll take this off after a moment as well, but because they were wealthy, they had attendants and retainers to help them put on their armor and take it off, and I don't. So that's why everything is hanging loose, and things will probably start to fall off of me during this lecture, and that's okay. So, here we are, it's week, I got to think about that for a second, week 10, Japan and the Heian period, and so we're going to talk about Japan's history, its development, its expansion, and how this ties into the literature that you've read for this unit. So as always, I'll start off with this get-up that I'm wearing. And the Soldier of the Week document tells you a lot about this stuff. I'm not going to go on and on about it here. But the deal is that this armor system, I guess, if you want to call it that, stayed intact for about a millennium, about 1,000 years. There were, of course, all kinds of changes and alterations and things like that. But as far as the basic style, it stayed intact for about 1,000 years. And so, just to some basic parts of this. This is the kabuto. This is the helmet, and these wings, those are described in the Soldier of the Week document. Those deflect arrows shot from the side. This is your neck guard, and this crest betrays the fact that this armor, Japanese developed samurai armor patterned after beetles, actually. And you can kind of tell that from the way this crest looks. They figured the best armor you can find on the planet is worn by bugs. So a lot of the design elements of this traditional Japanese armor reflect that influence. Okay, so this goes. I'm going to put this aside now. Okay, very good. So, very good. That was the kabuto. The mempo was that faceplate that I had on. Very uncomfortable. This is the do. These are sote. These things here. Your shoulder protectors, and of course one of these is higher than the other one because I don't have an attendant and the district won't pay for one. Anyway, so this armor is this is cheap knockoff Chinese-made armor. Nothing against the Chinese, it's just not traditional Japanese. It's patterned after samurai armor, but it's not the real thing. If it were the real thing, this would be made up of hundreds of little tiny plates sewn together in a very ornate fashion. And this is just kind of a costume knockoff. The real thing will cost you $20,000 or something like that. And again, while I am incredibly wealthy and am paid outrageously for my teaching, I can't quite afford that. Well, anyhow, and one other thing about this, you probably saw this if you read the Soldier of the Week document, which you should, even if you don't care, and that is that if you're into this kind of thing at all, one of the biggest collections in the world is at the Barbier Mueller Museum here in Dallas. It's a little it's free, first of all, and it's a museum on the second floor. It's above the St. Anne restaurant on Harwood, which is a really good restaurant, by the way. And it's free. It's got all kinds of weapons, helmets, armors, things like that. Better than a lot of collections in Japan. So you ought to check that out. It's really pretty cool. We're very, very fortunate to have that here. Anywho, on we go. Let's talk about Japan. I don't know if you know much about samurai. They've been a fixture in Western entertainment for, ever since the West came in contact with Japan. That first happened in the 1600s, but it happened in a major way in the 1800s. And Japan had to undergo this incredible transformation in the space of 150 years. And, obviously, like any culture, the Japanese have a number of traits that are extremely admirable and some that have gotten them into a lot of trouble. Just like American, just like fill in the blank, right? The problem is, of course, with Japan's history, it got them into the worst trouble ever in terms of a nuclear bomb. And so the reason I'm even mentioning that is not at all to be critical of Japanese culture. Rather, it's that we need to keep in mind if, even especially probably nerds like me rather than normal people like you, if we get too excited about how cool the armor is and the Bushido, the code of the warrior, and all this kind of stuff, there are admirable things about that. Or if you see some guy on a plane, some businessman reading like a samurai manual to war or some crap like that, that's all fine and good. But we have to remember that this kind of thing led to a lot of problems, It gave the Japanese a very distinct character that allowed them to accomplish an incredible amount in a short period of time in terms of modernization. And also, let's not forget artistic accomplishment. That's what, I mentioned that in the intro to the unit, is that what has made this culture so fascinating for me, and I know I'm not the only one, is that you have such a, these opposite poles of experience where Japanese culture is this incredibly, in some ways, enlightened culture that is philosophically complex, that is extremely literate. Its literature is of the highest level. And then on the other hand, you've got what led to World War II, and obviously Americans tend to be admiring of the samurai culture just because it looks cool or it's been in some cool movies or things like that. If you ask Koreans, Chinese, Vietnamese, these are all countries where either the samurai or their descendants intervened militarily in later years. Koreans probably not that wild about this kind of thing. They've got good reason not to be. Anyway, okay, fine. But we just need to think about that. One of my favorite movies is The Last Samurai. It's Tom Cruise, Ken Watanabe, the great Japanese actor. And it's about an American who is advising the Japanese army as it modernizes and all that. It's pretty cool, but again, even it tends to over-romanticize the whole samurai thing. And, Ken Watanabe is walking around holding a cherry blossom saying, don't worry, I'm not going to do the Japanese accent, but, a cherry blossom is a magnificent thing. You could spend your life looking for a perfect cherry blossom, and it would not be a wasted life. And again, that's realistic. I mean, that is indeed a philosophical construct that the samurai culture held, but it also, when your sword was ready by the armorer, you tested it, or you had the right to test it by walking up to a random peasant and lopping off their head. It probably didn't happen all that much, but it could. So let's get on to our, school, class, stuff like that. Okay, so the Heian culture is, as the PowerPoint points out, and as the introduction, I think, to your, I don't think I assigned the introduction to the text introduction to the readings, and you don't have to read it if you didn't, just read the stuff I told you to, but Heian culture, the arts are blossoming, but the government is sort of decaying because power, the court, the imperial family, is sort of losing itself in the arts, and they're kind of forgetting to govern. And the problem with that, of course, is that you have a lot of people in the provinces, a lot of powerful landowners who begin to resent that. They begin to think, this government isn't doing anything for me. I'll just run the show myself out here. And you have these small, powerful provinces, and that leads to the samurai gaining influence and becoming this new military class in Japan. It's a very powerful class. Okay, so I do want to point out one thing, though. I mentioned earlier the whole cherry blossom thing. Let's not forget that, though, because I think you can make an argument that in Japanese culture, maybe more than any other culture on earth, and that's an extremely bold claim, but you can make the argument that art and appreciation of art is absolutely essential, okay, even now. Even in a Japan that's been completely transformed, Japanese are expected to be able to appreciate the arts. And I don't mean by taking some core classes in high school and college or something. I mean, it is expected to be part of who they are. Because the way that they look at it, and I do find this admirable, because I think it's true, art is what allows us to connect with human experience. It's what keeps us from going crazy, frankly. And so art, to the Japanese, is something that you can't do without. You absolutely have to have it. Even if you're not an expert on literature or something, or painting, you have to be able to appreciate it. It's your duty. It's your duty as a citizen and as a human. And that is the truth. I mean, that's not been overblown, I don't think, by cinema and so on. Okay, so we need to keep that in mind is all I'm saying. In modern Japan, many older Japanese feel this is being lost, and they feel that as the culture changes and becomes more westernized, that the younger generations are losing this appreciation. But of course, every culture says that forever. But still, just to let you know what's going on. Okay, very good. The PowerPoint covers Japanese history to some degree. We'll cover some points of it as I pull this forward just a little bit, so it's a little more symmetrical. It'll fall off in a second anyway. Okay, so we're not going to go through the whole Japanese history thing because, frankly, it's extremely confusing. It is constant civil war, constant shifting alliances, and constant warfare. And that's, for the military history nerd, that's fine and good, but if you're not into that kind of thing, it can be very bewildering. So we're just going to touch on some very basic, essential points. So, up to 15,000 years ago, Japan is a bunch of islands, you ought to Google it if you don't know where it is. But up to 15,000 years ago, there were several land bridges. So your settlers, your first humans, have probably been there for, 200,000 years. And then, in about 400 BC, and those were hunter-gatherers, they set up a fairly sophisticated culture from what people can tell archaeologically. But then about 400 BC, you have waves of invaders coming over from the mainland of Asia, what is now Russia. But these people are arriving at the same time that other settlers or invaders are arriving from Korea. This is all kind of a mystery. They're not sure about much of this, but what they do know is that these new invaders, about 400 BC, they assimilated to become what we call now the ethnic Japanese. Now, what about the people who had been on the islands for, hundreds of thousands of years before? Well, unfortunately, they kind of got to play the role of the Native Americans here in North America, if you know what I'm saying. They got driven farther and farther, in their case, north, until they were sort of isolated in the northern islands. And now there's a movement in Japan, and has been for a few decades now, to learn more about those people and to make sure that they play a bigger role in Japanese society. But for years and years, they were completely, the Ainu is the main tribe of that group. And for years and years, they were completely marginalized in Japanese society. Anyway, okay, so that's your basic setup. Now, Chinese influence was enormous. The PowerPoint mentions this too, but the Japanese use Chinese script, and when you see written Japanese, what that is an outgrowth of what used to be just straight Chinese script. Now, interestingly, the Japanese language, of course, was different because, when you live on islands, you're going to be somewhat isolated and you'll have different patterns of evolution, so to speak. So, Japanese and Chinese were different spoken languages, but the characters were the same, which is kind of strange. But you could have a Chinese and a Japanese look at a sheet of paper, and they would pronounce the words differently, and some of the words would have different meanings, but they could each get some understanding of it. So the point is, Chinese influence was enormous. And that also counts for Confucianism. Now, we talked about Confucius a few weeks ago, and his influence is going to be gigantic in Japan, especially filial piety, the idea that you revere your ancestors, that you respect your elders, things like that. Obviously, that's as deep to the bone as it can get in Japan. It always has been, and that probably always will be, no matter what other influences reach their shore. But, so you've got filial piety, revering your elders. You've also got duty and ritual, okay? And you've also got education and learning. Those three ideas are very powerful influences of Confucianism in Japan. But as the Japanese evolved, they kind of picked and chose the things they wanted. One important thing about the Japanese is that they are not, similar to the Romans, okay, they are not above noticing what works in other cultures and borrowing it and improving on it. That's their thing. That's what they've always done. And in fact, I remember as a kid, my grandfather fought in World War II against the Japanese. He was in the Pacific. Battle of Leyte Gulf, Guadalcanal, And he, when I asked him, of course I was a kid, but I was asking him how come, because as a kid I always heard about how the Japanese were eating our lunch economically and everybody was buying Japanese cars, and a lot of Americans, especially his age, were really upset about that. And I asked him, well, what happened? We, dropped an A-bomb on them. How is it that they're defeating us economically now? And he said, and even though he was talking to a little kid, this holds true, I think, years later. He said, we came up with a plan for them to recover economically. They followed it, we didn't. That's it. So Japanese are known, one of the stereotypes of Japanese, and stereotypes are always unfortunate and never helpful, but, one of the ones that's absolutely true is their discipline. They are an extremely disciplined people. They always have been. They do what has to be done, for better or worse. And so the point of all this rambling I'm going on about is that, so Confucianism had a very strong influence in Japan. You got education, reverence for elders, and ritual and duty, okay? What they didn't adopt was Confucianism, though, in China really leaned on the idea of meritocracy, that the people who do the best work advance. The Japanese were not comfortable with that, not because they liked incompetence, but because obviously you have a small group of people, a monarchy develops, and it's not really in your interest to have a meritocracy. You want the elite ruling class, the people born into the right families to control things. So even though the Japanese did take systems that they saw around them that worked and expanded them, they didn't adopt everything they saw, because some of that would have been a threat to their cultural heritage, or at least how they viewed relationships between people. Okay, let's talk for a minute about, let's talk about writing for a second, writing and religion. You know from the PowerPoint that, or we just talked about how the alphabet's the same, Chinese, Japanese, but over the years, of course, it changes. Also, in the 5th century, you have, this is going to sound kind of confusing, but Koreans arrive who introduce a different script, and that's going to evolve. And then shortly after that, the Japanese, in the Heian period, the Japanese develop their own type of script, and that allows them to develop their own culture, their own stories, their own poetry. And as the PowerPoint mentions, women actually are able, oddly enough, because of this new script, to express themselves more readily. Because the traditionalist power structure in Japan, the powerful royal men, I guess, that ran everything, they didn't want to use this newfangled script. Women did. And as a result, what's interesting about the Heian period is we have a really surprising amount of literature written by women. It's very difficult to find in any other culture at that point in the world historically. Okay, well, I feel like I'm kind of being messy, so I got to focus here. Let's talk about Buddhism. The PowerPoint, again, mentioned Shintoism and Buddhism. Buddhism is going to play an extremely interesting role in Japan because most Japanese are Buddhist to some degree. But the thing is that as the years went by, or as the centuries passed really, Buddhism played a pretty aggressive role in Japanese politics. Westerners think of Buddhism as, anything goes and we're all part of the big system and, it's all relaxed and so on. Well, that's not true for every school of Buddhism. And in Japan, Buddhist monks actually became power players and they developed their own armies. And so the Heian period is really, it's called that because Heian was the new capital of Japan during this period, and the reason that the royal family moved it to what's now Kyoto, they moved it there because Buddhist monks were interfering in government. But the point of knowing all this is that Buddhism is going to play a very important role in the culture as well. Okay, let's see. So, let's get back to Japanese history. The PowerPoint discusses the Heian political scene. You've got the Fujiwara family during that period. They're the ones that marry the daughters into the royal family, and in doing so they're able to control really what happens and control policy. But even while they're doing that, again, the central government's kind of falling apart. provinces getting more powerful. The samurai class grows, then you've got a civil war, and after that civil war ends, which is really the end of the Heian period, you've got what's called a shogun. A shogun is a step below the emperor, but the thing is that from about 1200 to 1600, the shogun really ran the country. So he was this really powerful samurai, a warrior, and he was in charge of the army, and the emperor was technically above him, but not really. The emperor had to check with him to make sure everything was cool and that, you know, any kind of changes needed to be made. I mean, the shogun ran the show. And that's really what came out of the Heian period. So you've got, during the Heian period, an imperial family, but things kind of collapse. After it's over, you've still got an imperial family, but the shogun and the samurai really run the political scene. Okay, let's talk for a second about Heian aesthetics. What does aesthetics mean? Systems of art, systems of beauty, or value systems as far as I guess the life of the mind or the artistic life go. So a lot of what we consider to be traditional Japanese values in terms of art developed during the Heian period. You've got kind of an elegant simplicity, tranquility, a lack of adornment. I mean, that may sound goofy looking at what I'm wearing, but of course, for samurai, you know, the armor was a big deal because they were able to show off their status, like any other culture and their armor. But as far as art goes, the Japanese during this period developed the idea that less is more. And what's interesting about the Heian period is that when you look at the painting, when you look at even in terms of the poetry, and I'm sure you noticed this as you were reading some of the poems and the travelogue, that it's a culture that, I don't mean this to sound critical, but it tries very hard to look like it isn't trying. That's kind of the aesthetics of the Heian. You want to be philosophically able. You want to be intellectually nimble, but you don't want it to look like you're trying to be those things. That's probably not a great summation of the Heian system of aesthetics, but that is kind of what applies. Okay, you read Kamo no Chomei's account of the 10-foot square hut. And that's kind of an example. Now he became a monk, but he was a writer who wrote about tranquility and simplicity. And every time I read him, I think of Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau's Walden. I don't know if you guys had to read that in American Lit or anything like that. But the idea of isolating yourself in nature and getting back in touch, not just with nature, but with your whole role and the whole scheme, you know, and kind of fitting back in and this kind of thing. That's what Kamo no Chomei really was writing about in the account of the 10-foot square hut. You also read Kino Tsurayuki, the Tosa Diary, where he's writing in the voice of a woman, an assistant to a governor, which that shows you a couple things, a provincial governor. So it shows that the provinces are getting more powerful. And interestingly, he chooses to write in the voice of a woman, which seems unusual for the time. But remember, with the new script, the Kana script, women are writing more, and so it wouldn't be that strange to have a woman narrator or a woman writer, for that matter, at this time. And so Tsurayuki adopts the voice of a woman because he feels maybe that a female narrator can get away from some of the arrogance of a male narrator, maybe. I mean, I'm making that up, but it's possible. But that's an interesting thing to think about, is why he would adopt a woman's voice when he didn't have to. It probably gave him some freedom to explore some things, maybe freedom to be critical, right? Because even though a woman didn't have the same, I guess, political or social rights as a man in Japan at this time, it also would have been more difficult for a male to make criticisms. This is one thing that is true of Japanese history in Japanese culture, and that is, of course, you must avoid embarrassment. And the thing is that embarrassment doesn't just mean, you know, you spill your drink in front of a bunch of people. It has to do with, did you succeed? Of course, this is true in a lot of Asian cultures where personal failure reflects on your family, or that's how you look at it. In the West, not so much anymore. But in Asia, and particularly in Japan, failure reflects poorly on your entire family. And so, including your ancestors, I mean, not just you and the people you live with, but your line going all the way back, you have insulted them. You've dishonored them. And so, what I'm trying to get at is that criticism in Japan is a very touchy thing. You may recall a few years ago, Toyota had an issue with their brakes, and all in all, it was not that big of a deal. But a few people died, so yes, it was a big deal. But the point is, the whole company was shaken by it because it turned out, when all was said and done, observers from the outside said, Toyota's a gigantic company. How on earth could this have happened? How could they have not known about this? There were people complaining about their brakes for a year prior to this, maybe longer. The answer was that at the top levels of Toyota's leadership and the corporate structure, Toyota is a very Japanese company. What I mean by that is other Japanese companies you've heard of, Toyota, and I'm sorry, not Toyota, I was just talking about Toyota, Honda, Nissan, and not just the automakers, but the electronics companies as well. They have a lot of Westerners in their ranks now. Toyota, not so much. So the point is that at the top levels of Toyota, criticism stopped at a certain level because you did not want to insult your superior by coming to him and saying, hey, we've got a real problem, our brakes don't work. You didn't want to do that. And so from the outside that looked like, how on earth could this have happened? But it is rooted in Japanese culture. Honor and embarrassment, these are things that are tied together, and you must preserve your honor and your family's honor. All right, so man, that was a very long and hopefully not too objectionable tirade there, but okay. So back to history. So after the Heian period, we talked about how a shogun ran the show. The Europeans are going to show up in the 1500s, and they've got something in which the Japanese are very interested in, that is guns. And of course, for a country that has always gravitated towards civil war, guns are pretty bad news. They very quickly become a part of Japanese warfare. And so this stuff, you would think it would go away. It didn't. It got modified somewhat. It was a little lighter, a little easier. You'd be more mobile wearing it after the changes that were introduced after the arrival of firearms. But this same structure still remained. And even though guns were introduced, in a lot of ways, the methods of Japanese warfare didn't change that much, but things got much more bloody. There was a civil war, and then in the 1600s, Oda Nobunaga, he was a very powerful warlord, he finally, more or less, united the country. And so there's more to it than that, but for now, that'll work. And so the country was unified, and during that period, the rulers of Japan decided, we want complete isolation. We don't want to have any contact with any other cultures if we can possibly help it. So travel was restricted, not even to other countries, but within Japan. You had to have special permits to get from one province to another. They didn't want anybody traveling. They didn't want ideas spreading. They discouraged. They continued to be a literate culture, but they discouraged a lot of independent thinking. They really wanted that traditional social structure that nobody would question. This would last for about 200 years. Christianity arrived, and at first the Japanese welcomed it. The Japanese rulers welcomed Christianity because it was a counterpoint to those troublesome Buddhist monks we mentioned earlier. But after a while they realized, well, Christianity is not that great either for us because it does not, its gospel is not one of a ruler and then everybody underneath the ruler other than God. So they began to persecute the Christians as well. So Japan is, I'm sort of rambling, but the point is Japan is being besieged by a number of outside sources. As time progresses, you guys know this, you can't stay isolated. Even if you want to, you can't do it. North Korea is dealing with this right now. They've worked so hard and done so many horrible things to be absolutely isolated, and it just isn't going to work. I mean, sooner or later, that's going to collapse. And the Japanese struggled as long as they could to be traditional and isolated and very much Japanese, homogenous. They really didn't like the idea of waves of immigrants and their composition changing, not just racially, but culturally as well. Okay, so let's skip ahead to 1853. This is when Commodore Perry of the U.S. Navy sails into Edo Bay with some warships. Thousands of samurai ride to the shore of the bay, but they can't do a thing because he's got warships. And he essentially lands and says, you will open your country to U.S. trade. And there's nothing they can do about it. And they say, all right. But this causes a huge convulsion within Japan. It's very humiliating. With our 1,000 years of brilliant military culture, we can't stop this from happening. What are we going to do? And a number of younger leaders said, well, we're going to modernize. We have to modernize. We have to become westernized. And that's the only way to catch up, because we've seen that if we don't do that, we're going to be left behind, and our country will be humiliated again. And again, that's the one thing you cannot bear is humiliation, embarrassment. So the Japanese undergo, again, over about if you want to be specific, about a 50-year period from 1850 to 1900, their entire culture changes. I mean, many things about it remain, of course, but it becomes this extremely industrialized and to some degree westernized military state. And it goes from being this sort of isolated land that nobody knows about to becoming a colonial power in the space of 50 years, which is, I don't know that anybody's ever pulled off anything like that. It took an enormous amount of work and sacrifice, and that's very characteristic of the Japanese. Well, all right, so, and if you've seen The Last Samurai, the movie I talked about earlier with Tom Cruise and Ken Watanabe, that's the setting, is that after the American Civil War, Cruise is an American advisor who's sent over there to help the Japanese modernize their military. And because they are trying to overcome samurai resistance, they're trying to wipe out the samurai and get rid of the old Japan and enter into a new era. Okay, so what happens after that? I mean, there's no need to go into Japanese history, hundreds of years after the material that you read was written, but we know that in the early 1900s, Japan again became this colonial power on par with the Europeans. In World War I, Japan joined the Allies and took a number of German colonies in Asia away from Germany. Then Japan becomes very aggressive, invades China, wins a war with China, wins a war with Russia, and just in a very short period of time becomes extremely powerful. And that's going to be the setting for World War II. And of course, we know how that ended. It cost Japan 8 million dead, and it completely, again, that society has undergone a complete 180, an absolute about-face in a lot of ways in just 50 years' time. I mean, again, the amount of change that this culture has undergone is just astonishing. I don't think it can be matched anywhere else. And the Japanese have proven to be extremely adaptable people in a lot of ways. Okay, let's wrap this up, because I don't know if you're getting anything out of this at this point. So what do we take away about the Heian period? We've got literature about the natural world. The natural world provides echoes of human experience. Heian writers wanted their audiences to feel the natural world, not just walk outside and say, oh, that's a nice tree, but to see the change in the seasons around them, see the change in the natural world, and to feel that change within them, and to feel connected with the world. Because again, Japanese culture, appreciation of art is not something you do part-time, and it's not something you learn in a classroom. Well, I mean, you can learn it in a classroom, but it is critical to you as a human being. Okay, so Heian literature, natural world, constant change, and that tension between change and traditionalism informs everything Japanese. Their art, their history, their politics. I mean, every culture experiences that tension, right? Change, stability. But in Japan, it is so magnified, and always has been so magnified, because that country has often tried to be isolated, or to be its own universe. And sometimes they've succeeded, and sometimes they have not. Okay, I think that's enough. I apologize. But to wrap up, I'll just say, or as a parting word, if you're into this kind of stuff, go to the museum downtown. And as for my favorite samurai movie, it's not The Last Samurai. It's Akira Kurosawa, who is a very well-known Japanese director, did 2 movies based on Shakespeare plays. One of them is Ran, R-A-N. It's sort of based on King Lear. Another one is Throne of Blood. That's my favorite. Oh, that's cool. And that is sort of a take on Macbeth. And, oh, it's great stuff. Well, okay, that's all. Thank you very much. I will see you in about a week, and have a good one.